Hello and welcome to the June 7th edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I'm Anthony Bardaway here with Romeo Kukretsky.
Hey folks.
Starting off with some quick announcements. Again, we have launched on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. So if you would follow us on those, we're putting out more clips, getting ready to release more content on those specific apps to kind of diversify the output of Ukraine Without Hype. Meanwhile, just a note, we realize we haven't always been the most on schedule podcast in the world, but the recent power outages in Kyiv have made that especially difficult. There are some days this week where I literally had 2 hours of electricity. So we will be getting podcasts out, but it will be intermittent on how easily it is to work on them. So keep that in mind. That is probably the least important part of those blackouts, though, because right now it seems as though there's really no way out of them. The current announcements is to be ready for the power outages to go on indefinitely. It's not like 2 winters ago where we knew that if we could defend the power stations and the infrastructure, then we could get to the other side of it. By now, a significant part of Ukraine's electricity infrastructure has been destroyed, and there's no quick and easy way to fix that for several years. So the summer is not going to be as rough, but getting into the winter, there's really no great answer for power to be even fixed by the winter. This will have a lot of downstream effects. By recovering Ukraine's power industry, last time around, Ukraine was able to actually become an energy exporter and was able to stabilize some of the economic consequences of the war by keeping everything going. However, now I'm very worried because this is a difficult way to live, even far away from the front line. So I'm concerned about the potential economic losses as well as the potential next wave of refugees, of people who simply are not able to work anymore in Ukraine because of the power outages. So this is not getting as much attention in international media, it doesn't seem, but it is very catastrophic.
And like Anthony said, there's no real light at the end of the tunnel. Both of Ukraine's major hydroelectric plants, the Kakhovka and the Dnipro plants, are both basically out of commission. We all know what happened to the Kakhovka dam. It's been coming up on a year since
it's been a year. It's been a year. It was June 6th.
Since that just enormous tragedy, on top of that, now we have a second dam out of commission. Luckily, it wasn't blown up and we didn't have half of Ukraine flood from the Dnipro, at least. But it's not making electricity. The situation might get a teensy better when some nuclear plants go back online. They were undergoing maintenance, but considering that Russia does not seem averse to targeting our nuclear plants with missiles, they might just decide it's safer to keep it off on the advice of the IAEA or some other consideration. A lot of open questions, not a lot of good news on that front, I'm afraid.
Yes, well, with that news, there's not going to be any update on that, I'm afraid. Like you said, it's just how it's going to be. So moving on to our battlefield updates. And I'll begin the battlefield update with another strange bit of news from the international front in the Russo-Ukraine war. There is one source at the Kyiv Post who was the supplier of the footage of Ukrainian special operatives working in Sudan. And that same source has just leaked a video. They obviously have a direct connection to the HUR military intelligence, who is supplying them with this information in order to get it out. That's how these work. They're a designated leaker for these videos. But they then leaked a video of HUR operating in Syria as well, targeting Russian soldiers and assets in Syria. So this is yet another front. There has been some concern of why are these people fighting overseas instead of on the front line in Ukraine. And well, this is like a team of maybe a couple dozen guys in any of these locations. This isn't a huge bleed of manpower to do this, and Russia is using its influence in these other spheres by backing these other militants and dictators in order to secure its supply of resources, its political power, and being able to keep that off balance. I see a tremendous amount of value in. So Ukrainian who are killing Russians in Syria as well. But on the Ukrainian front, I'd say that within the last week, there has been no changes in the front line. The various Russian offensives have ground down a bit. Kharkiv front has functionally ended. The Russians are still there, of course. There's still ferocious fighting, but they have not been able to move forward any more than they have. And yeah, especially this last week, but looking back 2-3 weeks at this point of not being able to do anything. If we look at the other fronts, the Avdiivka front, the Russians are still making progress there, but within this last week, it has mostly been smoothing out various parts of the front. So if you would look at the maps a week ago, it was a much more jagged, lots of little pockets. Now Russia has kind of made that a bit neater lines, I guess. It's unlikely that Ukraine would have seen much value in holding these pockets. Hopefully, these were deliberate withdrawals. Of course, some of them would have been overrun by the Russians and therefore prisoners. We have seen a recent video coming out of Russian people sharing it, of Russians having a group of Ukrainian soldiers taken captive, making them sing Soviet songs and then beating them and having a false execution. So yes, some of these places will be the result of Russians surrounding and capturing these positions. But a lot of this territory next to Avdiivka right now is mostly being fought in largely empty farmland rather than within any kind of urban conglomeration. So I feel that pulling back is often the wisest decision in this case, because it's not like the Russians are taking much there of real high strategic value. And the rest of the front line, similar story, really not a tremendous change within the last week, which is welcome news considering the large momentum that Russia has had for the last months since the fall of Avdiivka, which gets us into one of the reasons why this halt of the Russian advance has happened, specifically in Kharkiv. Well, overall, I'd say that a good explanation for why these Russian advances have slowed down is that American supplies are finally getting to the front. There have been reports from some areas that they have not been required to do much artillery rationing as they used to. In the worst of it, there were reports that Ukrainian artillery crews did not even have enough to fire their, actual explosive rounds. But now that seems to have largely been fixed, and in some places, some artillery crews have been saying that they're more or less back to normal. Back to normal is still a disadvantage compared to Russia, but it's not like the desperate situation that it was before the aid came in. But the biggest change with Kharkiv is that our European partners in the United States finally, after so long, gave the permission to actually use Western-provided equipment to attack Russian positions within the territory of Russia. Up until now, any of the NATO-supplied equipment and the American or German or French-supplied equipment could not be used against targets within the Russian Federation and only in parts of occupied Ukraine. This was done out of fear of escalation. These governments did not want to see their weapons being used directly against Russia because they thought that would make the war worse in some way. But they finally relented because it became very obvious the problems with the Kharkiv offensive. A lot of soldiers on the Kharkiv front said that they saw this offensive coming. They watched the Russians have their buildup and staging locations. They saw the supply lines. They saw the positions for the artillery and the missile launchers and everything. They knew where that all was, but could not shoot at them, except with the smaller number of Ukrainian drones and other domestic equipment, which is not anywhere near as destructive. So this offensive was seen coming. They couldn't do anything about it, and that is the primary reason why it had so much success in its opening days. But because, like I said, this was so obvious, Our Western partners finally got the hint of how stupid this idea was. The cracks in this policy started off with France. France is being much more aggressive lately, as we've been talking about quite a bit. To the point where the last holdouts were Canada, the US, and Italy. Then eventually Canada said yes, and everyone just said yes, including the United States. You can use our weapons to attack into Russia finally. And within the first 24 or 48 hours of this permission being given, the Ukrainians used their Western supplied equipment to absolutely devastate the Russian staging areas on the other side of the border from Kharkiv. Tons of Russian missile launchers were destroyed. There is one video of a convoy operating in Kursk Oblast that was going around like without a care in the world until they had their front and back vehicles blown up and then completely devastated by Ukrainian fire. And this obviously led to much more difficult circumstances for the Russians to operate because, again, this has all been operating directly on the Russian side of the border to the point where all of their artillery and rockets and all that was able to be within Russia, making it impossible to do counter battery. Now, there are still some limitations on this. Not all of them are super public. There seems to be some kind of limitation on the use of ATACMS missiles, for example. There seems to be a limit that says that American weapons cannot be used further than 200 miles from the Russian border. It means they cannot be used against Moscow, for example. They said quite directly, the Biden administration said they don't want Ukraine attacking Moscow. But this is better than nothing. We'd all love to have missiles raining down on Red Square, but that's not going to happen in this near term, at least. It means that these attack sites that Russia is using will no longer be free because they have this border protecting them. The most immediate change with that is that Kharkiv has been hit for the last few weeks very heavily. We've talked about last episode with some of the various sites that have been killed, some of the mass casualties that have occurred. And for the last few days, that has gone quieter. There's a point where there is a day or two even where there was no hits in Kharkiv from the S-400 missile system, for example, which is obviously a huge relief. Of course, the damage has been done. Kharkiv no longer has any electricity production. It has been hit to hell for a long time. A lot of people have died, and the city has become very difficult to live in, causing another wave of refugees leaving the city. And I mean, if I was from Kharkiv, would I really want to go back a second time? People who fled the city during the initial siege went back because it became relatively safer, then had to leave again because of all the missile strikes. Are they going to go back? I don't know. I don't know if I would in that situation, unless I had literally no other options, which many of them don't. Many people have died. The city itself has been virtually killed, and this could have been very easily prevented with just this small change in policy. It's really disgusting. Hopefully, this signals again that these concerns about escalation are completely meaningless. Russia did not nuke London because Ukraine knocked out some artillery positions in Belgorod Oblast. We have to give this lesson again and again and again that there is no escalation management that makes any sense. Russia is already operating as much as it can. There is no escalation from where they already are. So what are we afraid of?
I mean, the only thing that escalation could possibly mean, right, is nuclear weapons. And Russia is not going to use nukes because it's failing to occupy a neighboring country. If we launched missiles on Moscow, maybe that very well could lead to nuclear escalation. But that's never going to happen in a million years, not least because the West doesn't allow us to. So there's anything short of that is not really going to trigger a Russian nuclear response because Putin knows very well his days are not only his days, but his entire power structure's days are pretty numbered after that. So there's no real risk of Russia using nukes in this war, unless, I don't know, he goes insane and decides to launch them anyway. But that's like,
there's no way to manage that.
That's not really a risk you can't really prepare for a risk like that. It's like I can be hit by a car when I go to cross the street to the supermarket. but you got to cross that street, and we have to get the Russians to leave. And the only way that's going to happen is if we can really hit them where it hurts. And on top of the escalation thing, I think what the Kharkiv situation has really proven is that it is absolutely devastating to have a pause in weapons shipments. That cannot be allowed to happen again. The fact that the tides turned pretty much instantly when those weapon shipments started coming, and that fact that we are able to do things now, we're able to stabilize, after which we'll probably go on the offensive, since it's kind of how the momentum of war works. There cannot ever be a weapons shipment gap again. Kharkiv is already, as Anthony said, it's not really livable. It's not really a livable city. It still has a huge population, though it's impossible to tell how many people are in the city right now, but it's not livable, and it could have been livable. The Russians would not have felt comfortable or not have been able to push on that front if they weren't seeking to distract from Chasiv Yar, because they had momentum there. They wouldn't have had that momentum if we had the artillery to keep them in their lines and unable to advance. So it's honestly shocking how we have presumably an entire military structure and then a super military structure and hundreds of thousands of experts and advisors and so on and so forth, and every flavor of advocate you want, and still this very simple, incredibly the base thing, keep the military supplied, is just left by the wayside. Like, what do you think is going to happen? We see the consequences of this already. This is the thing that is always going to happen the moment there is a munitions gap. If there is another one, guess what? The Russians will take more territory. They'll probably make another city unlivable. Maybe they'll finally move on Zaporizhia. Who knows? In order for that not to happen, the military must have enough shells. That's the long and short.
This issue of power outages, a lot of these power plants would still be intact and operational if Ukraine had enough air defenses. So for this half a year long of not receiving aid, the results of that are so obvious. This problem of us not having electricity during the day, that's because of this lack of aid in the form of air defense. These Russian advances came because of the lack of Ukrainian artillery specifically, as long as other forms of equipment. This can all be tracked to this central problem of we know what Ukraine needs. We know the equipment it needs. We know the policies that it needs in free hand to carry out, but micromanagers in the US have prevented that. Jake Sullivan, number one problem, and the Republican Party specifically preventing these deliveries of aid. This is your fault. Like, you did this. And we'll see if this lesson is learned. Mike Johnson, the guy who dug his feet in and prevented aid from being delivered for all that time, is now one of the advocates in Washington saying that Ukraine needs a freer hand to use American equipment. We did an episode of why he might have changed his mind on that, but has anyone learned anything? I don't know. In Europe, it seems like the answer is yes. The Europeans, going back to our New Year's episode, me saying that the people to watch this year would be the Europeans. And yeah, they seem to be stepping up more and more as time goes on. The European Parliament elections are coming up. We'll see what the results of that lead to. But yeah, we know what Ukraine needs, just provide it, stop micromanaging. It almost seems like it's a make work program. You need to have these people in Washington have something to do. So you need to have this guy, this idiot fail son who went to Georgetown, give him something to do. So have him make some convoluted set of policies when the simple answer is the correct one.
I mean, the obvious solution is, of course, just give them a bunch of coke and a beach house in Malibu, and they just won't bother anyone ever again. Short of that, you could just not listen to these people's advice and tell them that their ideas are stupid. Why people surrounding them in government don't do that, people who should be at least somewhat competent, is, of course, a question for a different kind of show, I'm afraid. But the fact is that these when you build these utterly inane, complex scaffoldings of theory and risk and countermeasure, instead of just looking outside your window, it turns out you're not actually doing a very good job. And when it comes to people in these high levels of authority and position, their fuck-ups literally kill people. Specifically, Ukrainians, of which I am rather fond of, being one myself.
Yeah, but to get in the mind of the DC blob is a terrifying place. Now is not going to be the moment where we dwell on that any further. So moving on to our next story. On May 31st, there was a significant prisoner exchange. 75 prisoners of war that were being held in Russia were returned home to Ukraine. This was the first prisoner exchange in 4 months. The Russians have been going long periods of time without these exchanges. The one 4 months ago was itself the first one in a long time. Part of this has to do with Russia not caring much about receiving its own soldiers back home. These are largely the dregs of society, and Russia frankly does not care at all about their fate. So getting these even within a 4-month gap is pretty impressive considering those constraints. Some of these prisoners were from literally the capture of the Chernobyl exclusion zone at the beginning of the war. Many of them were defenders of Mariupol. These are people who had been in Russian captivity for well over 2 years at this point. They had been starved, tortured, assaulted, in some cases sexually assaulted. And the pictures of these prisoners are trying to be polite to the people themselves. Unnerving, I'll go with. Emaciated to the point of near death. If you have seen concentration camp survivors, that is what some of these guys look like. It is grim. And a significant part of the rest of this episode will be talking about this condition of these prisoners and why they may be in that position. One of these prisoners that were released was named Iryna. In 2002, she was a recent graduate of the police academy in Mariupol as a detective, of young woman, fresh into her career as a detective. She was sheltering at the Azovstal plant during the siege of Mariupol, along with her boyfriend and family. After the fall of Azovstal, she was captured by the Russians because she was a non-combatant. She was told that she would be allowed to go on to Zaporizhia, being evacuated through a safe corridor out of Russian-occupied Ukraine into free Zaporizhia. Instead, she was transferred to a prison camp, and that is where she stayed. Well, not that specific prison camp, but shuttled between them for these last 2+ years. During that time, she had significant health problems, and it was when she began to develop kidney failure and very severe bronchitis when it was determined that she would be eligible for a prisoner of war transfer. Her boyfriend is still in captivity, and like I said with these other prisoners, she is very visibly unhealthy. The real stinger of this story, though, is I mentioned that she was promised a free passage to Zaporizhia and instead sent to a prison camp. And it turned out that the people who did this to her were employees of the International Committee of the Red Cross and the United Nations. There are pictures of her shortly after being captured where she was receiving information from ICRC officials, and they promised her, as a non-combatant, she would be allowed to go back to unoccupied Ukraine. And it was under the direction of the ICRC that she was transferred to as they say, a filtration camp where people are tortured, interrogated, etc., looking for people with nationalistic sentiments. Or just by nationalistic sentiments, I mean literally believe that they are Ukrainian. This is the opposite of what the ICRC is there to do. So what is the ICRC there to do? And what are some of the kind of ideological phrases that they're hiding behind to allow this to happen? So the ICRC was started in the mid-19th century. This was after warfare became much more mechanized, where there was a lot more freedom of information, freedom of the press, technologies. So views of the battlefield were reported back to Europe and people who did not otherwise have the opportunity to see war, and it was all very horrifying. The Crimean War specifically was noted for massive failures on the British, French, Russian, and Turkish sides, of none of them being able to actually care for the wounded, and many of the casualties of that war coming specifically from the incompetence of the medevac system, such as you could call a medevac system in the mid-19th century. It's non-existent. Then a guy named Henry Dunant was at the Battle of Solferino in the Italian War of Independence, saw similar things. No medical care, overall, but especially no medical care for the enemy side, and disrespect for anything that could be considered human rights. So this was the foundation of the original version of the International Committee for the Red Cross that was established alongside the first Geneva Convention called, quote, for the amelioration of the condition of the wounded in armies in the field. And one of their founding principles is this idea of neutrality. They cannot take any sides. They're there to help everyone. And part of that is they have to maintain friendly relations with everyone. They're not going after any particular country unless that particular country is denying the human rights of the people that the Red Cross is supposed to aid. At least that's how it works in theory. In practice, well, we'll get into practice. This principle of neutrality says that the ICRC also has access to prisoner of war camps. If you are in a prisoner of war camp, the ICRC is supposed to be there in order to make sure that you're being properly taken care of in accordance with international law, and also provide aid themselves if necessary. The ICRC is mostly the international organization. They are the diplomats of the Red Cross movement, whereas the Red Cross that you probably interact with is one of the national organizations, the American Red Cross, the British Red Cross, the Ukrainian Red Cross. So keep in mind going forward, I'm referring to these in two very different ways. Your national organization still probably does very good work depending on the country, but again, not always. This principle of neutrality has failed many times before, however. During the Holocaust, the ICRC was supposed to visit concentration camps to make sure that they followed international law. I don't feel like I need to explain that concentration camps were not in accordance with human rights law of even the early 20th century. So, in order to lie about that, the Nazis had them go on a basically PR tour of the Theresienstadt concentration camp, where they made it look real nice, made it look like the prisoners were being treated well, and the Red Cross fell for it. They reported that everything was on the up and up and didn't ask any further questions about the Holocaust. And that has kind of been the story in Ukraine. This is not the story universally. There are many places where they've done this correctly, though complaints abound as everywhere. But with Ukrainian prisoners of war in Russian custody have reported that they have never seen any representatives of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Aidan Aslan and Sean Pinner, two Western volunteers who had been fighting for Ukraine in Ukrainian armed forces and were captured during the siege of Mariupol and its surroundings. They both have books out, interesting people, but they both report that they never received anything resembling human rights monitoring in their cases, even as they were being tortured.
This is, of course, not surprising because due to the ICRC's neutrality, they can't really push people on their lies. I imagine a bunch of unarmed bureaucrats are not going to give a lot of pushback to a bunch of armed and murderous Russian soldiers. Really, in any case, if you do not have authority or force of arms to back up your point in the face of a hostile actor, guess what? They're going to sell you whatever bullshit they want. And the only thing you can do, which is why the Red Cross's reputation is going down the shitter, the only thing you can do is take it, because you need to maintain that neutrality. And if that neutrality prevents you from actually doing your job, well, that's the cost of providing unelected bureaucrats with sinecures, I guess.
Of course, yeah. Some random bureaucrat shows up and says, "May I see these prisoners, please?" And this Russian soldier with prison tattoos and marks on his armor of people he tortured or whatever says no. There's a limited amount of things they can do in the moment to say yes. So that's an obvious problem. However, even with this idea of neutrality, they are still supposed to advocate for following international law and reporting when it is broken, and they have refused to do that. The purpose of neutrality, the reason why it is there, is so they can have access. If they do not have access, what's the purpose of the neutrality? They aren't going to change this policy. This is, this is quite literally the first international NGO. It started the idea of it. So there's no going to be momentum that says you cannot be neutral anymore. But within this framework of neutrality, you're not breaking neutrality to tell the truth. And more importantly, the neutrality itself is not the goal. Helping people is the goal. If whatever policies you have in place are preventing you from doing that, those policies are a failure. So people are not letting you get into the prison camps. Put out a press release that says that Russia is acting in violation of the Geneva Conventions that say that prisoners have a right to access to the International Committee for the Red Cross representatives, that people are being tortured. Like there is delicate NGO speak that you can use to not be too aggressive with it, which is often how they work. But in this case specifically, it really shows the worst of it, where this woman, Mariana, was promised free passage by the UN and the International Committee for the Red Cross, and that they directed her to go to a prison camp. And that is obscene.
I mean, at some point you do have to ask, what is the extent of Russian infiltration or penetration into these structures? I mean, we have evidence that Russia has infiltrated basically every structure it can. It would be absurd to think that these kinds of international aid structures have also not been targeted by Russia. And quite frankly, beyond literally being infiltrated, there's no other reason for collaboration. If you are truly a neutral organization, then surely you would do something. You would raise some kind of alarm. The ICRC itself did not admit that its personnel were with Mariana when she was transferred to a concentration camp, or as the Russians call them, filtration camps, and not Ukrainian-controlled territory. They did not admit this. They didn't put out a statement saying, look, we were trying to escort this woman. She is a non-combatant to Ukrainian-controlled territory, and the Russian authorities interfered. Like, they didn't say that. They could have.
They said literally nothing.
They said literally nothing. It's the silence which is damning. It could, if they had been documenting and reporting all of these Russian violations, no one would have criticism of them. No one would have a problem. Of course, people would understand that a bunch of unarmed bureaucrats are not going to be able to stop a Russian soldier from taking people to whatever torture camp they want. But if they reported on it, at least we would know. At least the organization could say, look, we are trying to help these people. We are trying to stick to our mission of neutral humanitarian aid, no matter what. But since they're silent, the only possible explanation is the fact that the organization is corrupted by Russia. Either the people on the ground are corrupted, or the national organization is corrupted, or they have agents within the within the ICRC itself. Like, we know these things must be true because Russia does that all the time. And the only question is, how much of a role does it play in what is essentially collaboration?
Yeah, the other piece of this puzzle here is the United Nations, and that's where it gets even more complicated. When we say United Nations, I feel like the discourse in a lot of places is referred to the UN as some singular unified thing, which it absolutely is not. On the surface, it is like the United Nations. It's made up of its member nations. There's no decision-making that the UN takes on its own, divorced from its member states. In the General Assembly of the UN has by and large voted in favor of Ukraine on various condemnations. I mean, there's not much a UN General Assembly vote directly does. Russia can take any condemnation it wants and just not care, as is the case. But of course, when you get into its constituent parts, the different organizations that make up the UN system, first of all, keep in mind that because of the way these are staffed, Russia, as a major figure within the UN, one of the permanent 5 in the Security Council, does get a fair amount of say on what the staffing will be. So it's not even infiltration at that point. It's just Russia saying we would like these people to have these positions within various parts of the UN system.
Yeah, unfortunately for the UN's case, it is literally designed that way. It's not corruption if it's made to function that way.
Yeah, that's how it works for literally every country. There are scheduling in place for who gets who gets forwarded to have these roles. It's supposed to be like a sharing situation, and Russia as a global superpower, and especially the Soviet Union as a global superpower when the UN was first founded and Russia taking up its positions within the organization, Russian influence within it is baked in, just as American influence in it is baked in, French, British, Chinese. It's there. And there's really nothing that can be done about it. And there's no way to really replace that with any other system that doesn't look exactly the same. There's no other way it can look. But getting into these individual constituent parts of the UN, they have all acted pretty differently. I'd say UNESCO, UN Education, Science, and Culture Organization, they kind of stepped up in a strange way, considering that they're not exactly the most activist part of the UN system. They're the people that say that here's a protected heritage site. Please don't do anything to destroy it, please. And near the beginning of the full-scale invasion, they declared the entirety of the Odessa downtown area as a historic site to be preserved. So technically, when Russia bombs downtown Odessa, they are also destroying UN-protected cultural artifacts. There's not much that can be done about that. It's not like there is no UNESCO police that will bust down your door if you decide to blow up a ancient Greek temple or something. But they stepped up in that interesting way, considering that they have the least authority to do anything.
Does give Ukraine greater ammunition in ongoing and to be filed criminal cases, in the ICC and ICJ cases against Russia, where they can say, hey, look, the UN declared this a protected site and the Russians blew it up. So it does play some role, but yes, unfortunately, there are not internationalist or globalist UNESCO cops busting down people's doors for messing with monuments. As cool as that would be.
That is the basis of Carmen Sandiego, now that I think about it. Look at other organizations. We have UNDP, and full disclosure, I have done freelance work for the UNDP, so I'm not entirely neutral on that, but the UNDP has done significant amounts of reconstruction. They are not a frontline organization. They are not there to do humanitarian relief. They are there in the name development. They're helping build things. If you go to various deoccupied areas, you will see the UN symbol on, say, like a destroyed building some house had its roof blown off, and the kind of replacement temporary roof has UNDP written right on it. So they're doing stuff as well. And, we could probably make a list of various UN agencies and give them some kind of grade, but that is a very significant project that would take many months to do, and not me making stuff up off the top of my head. However, the specific organization that we're talking about here, the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. These are the direct aid people. And I would say that they have failed tremendously throughout the entirety of the war. You go to the front, they are virtually nowhere to be seen. And I am not the only person making this observation. Everyone who has ever done any kind of aid effort at the front will tell you the exact same thing. The OCHA is terrible. They're terrible. And in this case specifically, they're supposed to be coordinating this relief effort in Mariupol, and like the ICRC, delivered people into the hands of Russian concentration camps. In both of these cases, I feel that we can pin this on specific people. We have photographs of these people. The OSINT people, the open source intelligent people, have not given a direct finding on this yet. However, we have seen their faces. Their faces exist in some database. Someone who's better at this stuff than me should be able to figure out who these exact people are, find out who their bosses are, and ask them questions about why they failed in such a spectacular way. But returning to this issue of the ICRC as well and the difference between the national organizations, as far as blame goes, do not blame your local Red Cross for these problems. They're probably fine. When you do go to the front, you will see the logos of other Red Cross organizations. The American Red Cross is here. The Ukrainian Red Cross is, of course, extremely active. Please support the Ukrainian Red Cross if you can. It's not their fault the ICRC sucks. They have no say in that whatsoever. There is a complete organizational distinction between the national organizations and the international one. So don't punish them when they do very important work. Unless, of course, you're Russian or Belarusian. The national Red Crosses of those countries have directly facilitated the concentration camps, the stealing of children. We do know that the Belarusian Red Cross, specifically the head of it, has been very active in kidnapping Ukrainian children, many of which were transferred to Belarus. They are 100% regime stooges, and that is usually how it goes. A national level Red Cross will be a reflection of the country that it is in. And especially if you're in an authoritarian country like Belarus, they're not going to allow the Red Cross to be an independent organization. That kind of defeats the whole point of being an abusive dictatorship. So yes, Ukrainian Red Cross helps Ukrainian children. Belarusian Red Cross kidnaps and tries to steal the identities of children. Russian Red Cross is directly involved in the organization of these concentration camps. International Red Cross, very silent about its seeming role in allowing all this to happen and not saying a word about the tortures that take place and not really raising too much of a ruckus about the point that they are not even allowed access to prisoners in pretty much every single case. So our next story is about another tragedy involving a young woman. However, in this case, she was a soldier and she was killed. Her name is Iryna Tsybukh. Her call sign is Cheka. She was a member of the Hospitalers, a unit made up of medics. She was killed on the Kharkiv front on May 29th. She was pretty famous. She had a large following, sharing her work, which helped with fundraising. Again, to go to the Hospitalers, they are in our list of organizations to support. So if you go to our description, our list of resources, the Hospitalers are in there if you would like to support her unit. And like I said, she was very influential in raising money and helping people and getting the word out, building morale. Ukrainska Pravda included her in the Power of Women project. As recently as March 24th, she was listed among 100 influential women in the country. And when she died, her funeral was gigantic. They filled the streets of central Kiev. It took place on Maidan in the cathedral, and many soldiers and volunteers were there showing their respect to this woman. And she was, well, probably knew that the end was coming and had written about what people should say when she died, so I thought we could share part of that. This letter that was later shared on Instagram, it was translated into English by St. Javelin. I'll leave a link to that in the description of the episode to read the whole thing, but as an excerpt, the one part that's being quoted quite often I think is quite powerful. In order to be free, you have to attain new kinds of values. You have to understand yourself well, know who you are, know what happiness means to you and how to achieve it. Once you have these answers, the most important thing is to keep moving forward. Here in Donetsk, I'm on my path, being myself and doing what I want. Nothing else matters, really, which is why writing this letter comes so easily. Right this moment, same as the moment when my time comes, I have no regrets in the face of death because I'm finally living the life that I wanted. I won't lie, to feel this true freedom, I'll need more rounds of therapy, face more fears, and shed more tears. Today, everything is behind me. My life is over. It was important for me to live with dignity, to be honest, kind, and loving. Today we are working for the heroes, and it's a great way to reaffirm my values. To be that person truly. Thank you to everyone who loved and supported me. Don't mourn me. Life is so short. If it continues after death, we'll meet again. Goes on much longer. She was a very eloquent person. Like I said, I'll leave that in description. And yet another example of these, most active, most real key parts of the nation being destroyed because they put themselves in danger. Herself, of course, is a medic, and the hospitalers to help her fellow Ukrainians to get through this war. And she paid the ultimate price. She died just short of her 26th birthday. She'll be 25 forever. Heroям slava.
Heroям slava.
To round out this episode, there was a lot of, talking about prisoners and killed soldiers. This next bit is going back out into the zoomed out look on politics, international diplomacy. And the most important thing that happened recently was this Asia Security Summit, also known as the Shagri-La Dialogue, which takes place in Singapore. One of those big international summits that all the important people show up to. In this case, it is mostly, of course, about security issues in East Asia, about the growth of Chinese power, of stabilization, the issue of Chinese aggression around Taiwan, things in that neighborhood. However, President Zelensky also went this year. His main purpose for being there was to organize support for a peace summit in Switzerland, which will occur later this month in June. This peace summit, it's a little bit counterintuitive. It's not there to be a direct negotiation with Russia. In fact, Russia's not invited at all. Instead, the Ukrainians are trying to get as many representatives from as many countries as they can to come to this summit to create a united front. So these are the demands not of just Ukraine, but of the world on Russia. And the invitations have been far and wide. Basically, if you want to come and you are a country, you can come. Ukraine wants you there, wants it to be as much of a consensus as possible. However, the big obstacle here seems to be China. Zelensky and the Ukrainian Foreign Service are accusing China of trying to convince countries not to go to this summit. China has said that it can only support one of these summits if Russia is there as a negotiating partner, and that's not what this is about. China itself is not going. Like I said, they are exerting pressure in various ways to stop other people from going, and this being an East Asia summit, that was an important thing to talk about there. At the summit, of course, China's being aggressive in other ways. They were accusing Zelensky and the Ukrainians of lying about this. This is on the heels of other accusations that through one way or another, Chinese weapons were finding their way into the hands of Russian soldiers. In the grand scheme of things, I can understand ways that can happen without it being a direct decision by China to supply the Russian army. There are American, all kinds of weapons in the Russian military hands, and they are not saying the extent or seriousness of this Chinese supply to Russia. So that could mean a lot of things, but who knows? We'll have to hear more about it. So lots of diplomatic going back and forth in, the proverbial smoky rooms. But the other thing that happened at this summit was that Zelensky gave his assurances that Ukraine recognizes both Palestine and Israel and is trying to get an end to the war in Gaza. A lot of people thought this was strange. Isn't Ukraine a supporter of Israel? And well, yes, but also a supporter of Palestine. Ukraine has, for many years, recognized the state of Palestine as a country.
It was one of the first European nations to recognize Palestine, in fact.
Absolutely. This is long-standing Ukrainian policy. I've been trying to explain this for the longest time. It is... Earlier, I was pointing out to someone on Twitter that it's not even a very long walk between the Embassy of Palestine and the Embassy of Israel. And as you're making that walk, you're walking past the Embassy of Lebanon. These recognitions are there. Everything that he said in this speech of wanting the war to be over and recognizing both countries is just Ukrainian policy. It's never been stated otherwise. People have projected their own ideas of international politics on Ukraine, just as they are projecting all kinds of domestic bugbears and all that onto Ukraine. Ukraine is its own country. It has its own policies. These policies may or may not be what you like, but no matter whether you like them or not, they are Ukrainian policies. And like I said, in this specific case, not changed. This is not like a big shock announcement like people were presenting it as. Anyway, that just kind of annoyed me of Zelensky just saying Ukraine policy, and both the array of responses to this were insane. Oh, you're betraying Israel by doing this. You are, oh, did you finally come to the right idea after like seeing Israel doing all these bad things? Like, no, it's the same. It's all the same. Calm down. Elsewhere in diplomatic news coming out of the European Union. Now, this bit of news is quite fresh. None of it has been completely formalized yet, but it seems like it's going through, which is that Ukraine and possibly also Moldova have fulfilled the checklists of their European Union candidacy requirements, and they will begin EU accession talks. They have done the things that they're supposed to do in this round of things to do, and will move on to the next round of having things to do. So, I mean, this is all very bureaucratic. So when we say that Ukraine can begin accession talks can last a decade. Like, this is not going to happen tomorrow. But what this says is that Ukraine was able to go through the various steps of anti-corruption, of transparency, of rule of law. All of those
let's
things.
be honest. We're not worse than Hungary or Bulgaria. And that's really all that counts.
That's true. Nobody is worse than Hungary. Anyone that is trying to join the EU, nobody's worse than Hungary anyway. So these are all steps. Bureaucracy news is hard to kind of get too excited about, because when I say moving on to the next stage, and the next stage can last a decade, welcome to the European Union, but still a good sign that at least we know that these steps were completed, which means that Ukrainian governance is better now than it was 2 years ago. And considering this is in a state of war, that is an incredible thing to say about any country. However, as far as our fellow part of these rounds of EU talks, I mentioned Ukraine and Moldova doing well. Georgia, I don't have much of an update on Georgia other than a group of armed thugs attacked the offices of the main opposition political party, which is never a great sign of how a democracy is functioning. And they are now being threatened by EU executives by saying that because of the severe decline in political standards in the country, they could even lose their freedom of movement in the EU. And as far as Ukrainians, when that was the main thing that Ukrainians wanted, was to be able to travel in the EU without a visa. I assume Georgians are the same way. Everything else is kind of behind the scenes. Oh, your company might get a better deal on tariffs going to some European country. That's all very nice. But to the average person, being able to get onto a plane and land in Greece and have everything be okay is the most direct and welcomed part of the European Union and Europe as a political project. So if that's taken away as punishment for their political actions, very, very big deal. The biggest of deals. And this last thing we'll talk about is that the Ukrainian parliament has recently passed an English language law. Language politics in Ukraine are always extremely complicated, but in this case, what they want is more people in Ukraine to speak English and put in a variety of programs in place to encourage that. So first of all, the government is saying that they want to expand English language instruction in schools. It's already there, but also to expand it into kindergartens as well. So, here, kindergarten more means preschool, as you would say in the US. So, expansion of English language classes. The next bit is that managers in the civil service, in the bureaucracy, in the police, not the frontline people, but if you want to be some kind of middle manager, you'll have to know English. It also means that if you're going to have contact with these bureaucracies, you'll have the right to conduct this in English if you absolutely have to. If you need emergency services and you dial the local equivalent of 911 and talk to them in English, they should be able to respond to you in English. There will also be support for cultural events. They want there to be, at Ukrainian cultural events, they want there to be more English written materials, dubbing of audiovisual materials. And lastly, they want there to be more English language movies. In movie theaters, how it is right now is that most movies will be dubbed into Ukrainian. The government is now going to be subsidizing movie theaters in order to show movies in the original English language with Ukrainian subtitles instead.
Now, this has actually caused a bit of pushback from the Ukrainian cinema industry because these dubbers are a part of it, and they have filed numerous complaints to to Parliament saying that if Parliament doesn't stop requiring, if it doesn't remove this requirement from the bill, then their industry will go basically out of business. There won't be any point to having official dubbers around if people will get used to watching foreign movies with subtitles instead.
And it kind of leans into the whole issue of Ukrainian language protections. Let's face it, if Hollywood movies are able to go into a country and control the market, they're going to control that market. They are better funded. It's the unstoppable juggernaut of the American cultural industry cannot be stopped. But in this case, this was pulled away. Originally, they wanted it to be just subtitles instead of dubbing. Now, basically what they want is to have more English language movies in theaters rather than the strict system that was in the original draft. And in many cases, the original draft of most Ukrainian legislation, especially legislation around language issues, tends to be quite bad until people complain enough to make it work better. So now the goal is to have, in certain theaters, 10% of their showings be in English. The official numbers here is that if a specific movie theater, if a cinema screens at least 8 English language movies per month, and 2 of those screenings happening each week, so 2 showings per week, not a huge number, but a lot more than now, specifically during prime time, after 6 p.m., when people are home and going out for entertainment, then the state will compensate it by, if you're not selling enough of those tickets, that this becomes a problem, then the state will help you out. This will all be subsidized in a way. Right now, like I said, most of these movies are dubbed. If you want to see an English language movie with the original audio, before the full-scale war, there was more offerings. Now, very slim pickings. We'll get the Marvel movies. The Disney movies go through. Romeo and I went out with some friends to see the Dune sequel a few weeks back. That came over in English. Right now, the only English language movie you can see is Furiosa. I'll probably do that this weekend. So going from 1 or 2 movies at a time and only the really big ones to saying 2 a week, 8 a month, that's a pretty big change that they're offering. So why are they doing this? To operate in the modern economy, to operate in global companies, to get educated, to be a global citizen in this year 2024, you have to know English. That's just how the world works. English is the global language. And the best thing for Ukrainian parents to do is to make sure that their kids learn English. They can get that job at that foreign company, that they can go to that foreign university. They can make connections with not just English speakers, mind you. I'm not talking about everything being reliant on America or anything like that. But English is the common language of Europe. It's the common language of everywhere. People who do not speak English as their native language will communicate with each other in English. That is seen as a priority that has to change. Ukraine has been wanting to do that, but it's been held back, partially because of cost. Which gets into the problems with that. So the expansion of English language education costs money. If you want everyone to speak English, you need to fund that program. You need to put teachers everywhere who can effectively teach English. In a lot of cases, you need native English speakers who can speak to language learners directly in that language so they can learn it. I started off as an English teacher here to pay the bills. And there are these networks of private English language instruction that a lot of parents will send their kids to because the English language instruction in a lot of schools is just not good enough.
My wife is actually an English teacher, so I am a little personally invested. As hopefully this won't sound too awful, but in some ways the war was good for her business because people went abroad and they need English. Lots of Ukrainians who kind of Dunning-Krugered their way into thinking their English was passable arrived in Europe or in Canada or in Australia or in the UK or wherever and realized that no, the English lessons they were taught in middle school in the 90s or 2000s was not actually good enough for them to hold a conversation. And it's hopefully this bill will push more people to learning English and thus keeping my wife employed.
So with that is our episode for the week. Thank you very much for listening. The difficulty in the production of this podcast due to power outages will slow things down a bit, but we'll still get them out there. We'll still be reporting the news from Ukraine. If you'd like to support Ukraine more broadly, go to our description, see those links of charities you can donate to, news sources you can get information from, including the Hospitalers. Look at those. If you would like to support Ukraine without hype, please talk to your friends and family about us, review, go to our expanded social media presence, get algorithm working for us. If you would like to support us financially, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine without hype and join our list of supporters. But thank you very much to all of our patrons. So thank you very much to Deborah Grazer, Mandy McNerlin, the voices in my head are from Big Pharma, David Shepard, Giorgio, Ivana Kokriatskaya, Michael Drucker, Mike Perrone, Anna Karen Person, Anonymous, Barbara, Dennis Napalm, Debbie, Dimitri Litvin, Etienne Soleil, James Burke, Jan, Yanara, Jenny Louise, Kevin Alberton, Marguerite, Michael Wickman, DLM, Shieldwall, Silas Frank, T. Bart, Vivek, Ada McDonald, Alex Grochmal, Anastasia, Captain Technical, Chris Pennington, Christopher Yee, Daniel Spring, David Wall, Emily Bavona, Evelyn, Francois, Grace Krause, Had to Laugh, Jacob Holm, James Wise, Jared Bradley, Jared, Julia Lindsay, Justin Ard, Kyle Johnson, Lara De Leon, Laurie Halila, Levy Grove, Marianne, Matt Miller, Melissa Kaselko, Anonymous, Noam Hart, Paul Bailey, RDK, Sanjay, Scott Berry, Scott Gengris, Scott Tukayuk, Stephen Akers, Settle Knife, Thomas Sobiek, Veronica, Victoria Leontoneva, and Wandering Lens. Thank you all very much for your support. And until next week, Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!